my prediction video for UFC Fight Night Holloway versus Kattar. Let's start at the bottom. The first fight is Jacob Kimball versus Austin Lingual. And to me, these guys are pretty similar. They're both pretty well-rounded. They both primarily like to strike, but they have decent grappling games. My biggest thing is I just think Austin Lingual is a little bit better everywhere. And to me, Jacob Kimball didn't impress me in his debut, as were Austin. He looked alright. I just think he was fighting someone really good in Yusuf Zalal. I also feel like Austin, he was undefeated when he came to the UFC, and Jacob was like 8-2. So, just based on the fights that I saw with them both in the UFC, I'm leaning towards Lingual because he just looks a little bit better to me. Next is Sasha Morris versus Vanessa Mello, and to me, these two chicks are not that great. They're both below average, but I just think Sasha Morris is a little bit better. They're both striker jiu-jitsu chicks, but like I said, I just think Sasha's a little bit better everywhere. There's not much to say about this one either. It's kind of low-level people, Next is David Zawada versus Razaman Amiv. And to me, David Zawada is a striker jiu-jitsu dude, and I feel like he's the type of guy that can beat almost anybody. His striking's good enough and his jiu-jitsu is good enough to where he can knock out or submit most people. The biggest problem with him is kind of just like an overall wrestling thing and just guys kind of being a little bit better than him. He's 1-2 in the UFC, but he's only fought 3 really good people. But I think the same thing's going to happen in this fight. I think that one of the biggest things is his wrestling's a little bit weak, and I think Razaman's biggest strength is his ability to kind of clinch with people and just hold them against the fence. And if it's not just straight up on the ground, I don't think, Zawada can just use his jiu-jitsu whenever he wants. And I think that in terms of the wrestling against the fence and the clinch, I do think Razaman's a little bit better. And I just think that's where 90% of this fight's going to be. I don't think David's going to be able to use his kickboxing at the range. And I think that Razaman's going to win a 30-27 decision the way he wins most of his fights, just with solid, dirty boxing against the fence and solid cage control. So I'm going to lean towards Razaman to win by 30-27 decision. Next is Carlos Felipe versus Justin Tafa, and to me, this fight's really hard because I think it's just 2 good kickboxers, and it's kind of just who can catch who first. I haven't seen Tafa go past the first round yet. I think in his debut, he just rushed it and got caught, and then in his second fight, he looked way better because he just wasn't rushing it. Carlos Felipe, he just won his last fight because he just had really good conditioning. He basically just kept going and going and going. I do think Tafa's the better striker, but I just don't know what his cardio's like, and that's my biggest fear. I want to pick Tafa because I think, like I said, I think he can catch Carlos in the first round and knock him out. But until I see Tafa go past the first round, I'm just going to have to lean towards Felipe. I was initially going to pick Tafa, but I can't pick against Felipe right now just because he beat the guy that beat Tafa, and not just that. Like, when I saw him in that 3-round fight, his cardio looked good. He his wrestling and his striking all kept up for 3 straight rounds. So, because of that, I'm leaning towards Carlos Felipe to win by decision. Next is Wu Yayan versus Jocelyn Edwards. And to me, I think Jocelyn's a decent fighter, but she's taking this fight in really short notice. And I think both these chicks are primarily strikers. And because of that, I'm kind of just leaning towards Wu Yan. I feel like she already has the UFC experience. I thought she was a little bit of a heavier hitter. And I feel like other than Jocelyn being able to like submit her, which I don't necessarily think she can, I think Wu Yan is just able to kind of pick Jocelyn apart. I don't know if she'll finish her, but I do think she wins at least 2 of the 3 rounds. Next is Philip Hawes versus Nasruddin. I can't say his last name, but to me, Philip Hawes, my biggest fear with him is kind of the same thing that I saw in the Ultimate, not the Ultimate Fighter, but the Dana White Tuesday Night Contender Series, which was he tends to slow. And his UFC debut, I know he knocked that guy out really fast, but in that fight where he won, it did look like he was getting a little bit tired, even though he knocked that guy out. My biggest thing is I think Nasruddin is a good enough striker and especially good enough grappler to wear Philip Hawes down. I mean, you basically look at Nasruddin's last fight, he was fighting the same exact kind of fighter, basically, a really heavy hitter in the first round, but then a guy who's kind of, going to slow down the longer the fight goes. And I feel like Nasruddin, as long as he can kind of do what he did in this fight that he did in his last fight, which is just, whether the big punches a little bit, he didn't even get hit that much, in all honesty. I mean, he was kind of outlanding the guy he fought, and then more or less just use his grappling as much as possible to wear this guy down. I think Nasruddin can easily win at least a 29-20 decision, if not get like a third-round submission. And because of that, I'm leaning towards Nasruddin just because I think he's the much more well-rounded and the much better conditioned fighter. Other than Phil Paz knocking him out in the first round, I just don't think he wins. Next is Punahele Soriano versus Dustin, I can't say his last name, or Dusko. To me, the biggest thing is I think Punahele is a little bit faster and a little bit stronger, but I think Dusko's got a big advantage in the striking and the grappling in terms of technique. I don't think Punahele is a significantly higher level faster than him or significantly higher level punching power than him. But I do think Dusko is at least 1 or 2 levels higher than him in technique in terms of the striking and the grappling. I really want Punahele to win because he's from Hawaii, but he's realistically, I just don't think he does. I think on the feet it'll be close, but I especially think that if Dusko gets this to the ground, which I think he will, I think he kind of dominates this fight. And because of that, I'm going to lean towards Dusko to win by finish in like the 2nd or 3rd round. Next, we got Joaquin Buckley versus Alessio Di Chirico. And I really don't know why Alessio Di Chirico is kind of getting this fight. Joaquin Buckley, I think he's, won 2 of his last 3 UFC fights. And Di Chirico is on a 3-fight losing streak. I think they're just trying to build up Joaquin right here. I don't think Di Chirico is an easy fight. I think that this is 2 good boxers, kickboxers. And they both have strong kind of overall takedown defense. They don't really try to go for takedowns that much. But I think both guys can wrestle well enough to where they'll both be able to keep it on the feet. I don't think either guy is good. They're both much better with their takedown defense than their takedown offense. And that's because they both want to strike. And I think this will be a kickboxing match the whole time. And I don't think Joaquin will finish Alessio, but I think he'll definitely win at least 2 of the 3 rounds, if not all 3. And I think it will be a fun kickboxing match, which is primarily probably why they made the fight, and that building up Joaquin. But yeah, I think this probably goes all 3, and I think Joaquin probably wins 2 of the 3, if not all 3 rounds. Next is Santiago Ponzinibbio versus Li Jingliang, and this is kind of like the same thing. I think unless Ponzinibbio was, I think he was injured, but unless that injury completely fucked him over, he was ranked like 6 or 7 before his long layoff, and he deserved it. He was on like a 7 or an 8 fight win streak, and against good guys. I think he had like 1 or 2 scrubs at the beginning, like normal, but his last 6 or 5 or 6 wins were all against really, really good guys. And Lee, my biggest fear with him is he's always never had the greatest striking defense, and I feel like Ponzinibbio, if this is really going to be just a straight kickboxing match. Neither of these guys like to shoot for takedowns that much, and I'd say on the ground they're about even, but I think Ponzinibbio is good enough to keep it on the feet. I just think that Ponzinibbio is a little bit cleaner with his striking. I think that, we've seen Lee get caught a lot, when he fights the better strikers. When he's fighting kind of guys around his level, he can look amazing. But I think Ponzinibbio, unless that injury screwed him over, I think he'll be able to kind of snipe Lee when he needs to. And I don't know if he'll knock him out. Just don't think Lee's ever been knocked out. But I think he's going to win a decision at least, if not get a late 3rd round TKO just from accumulated damage. So I'm leaning towards Ponzinibbio. Next is Carlos Condit versus Matt Brown. And to me, the biggest fear I have is Matt Brown has always been kind of a cardio guy. And when he is in his last fight, he was gassing. Like, I've never seen Matt Brown gas, but that was bad. That was a fight that he really easily should have won. Like, he rocked that guy really bad, was hurting him really bad, and, the old Matt Brown, that would have been it. That guy wouldn't have recovered. He would have taken him down and kicked the crap out of him for 5, the rest of the next 3 rounds. In this one, he hurt him, and then the guy was able to recover and get away, and then Matt Brown was just tired and couldn't put it on him. And to me, Carlos Condit, his last fight against Court McGee, that was the best he's looked in his last 5 or 6 fights. He was throwing the volume, using the foot movement, and, mixing up the boxing and the kicking and stuff like that. To me, I'm just basing this on their last fights for the most part because I feel like that's probably about where they're at right now. Carlos Condit looks like, I don't think he'll necessarily fight in the top 15 again, but I think he can be one of those guys that can be between like 16 and 25 for as long as he feels like, you know what I mean, like a solid vet that can still compete. Matt Brown, to me, I still think he's good, which is why he was able to do so well against a guy who's such a good up-and-comer, but like I said, if that was Matt Brown from like 3 or 4 years ago, that would have been the end of that fight. And it just kind of disappointed me to see how tired he got and how much slower his punches were. And I feel like if that's what happens in this fight, Condon's just going to dance around him and pick him apart. I also think that if this ever hits the ground, I give a big advantage to Condon. I think that they're both good jiu-jitsu guys, but the difference is that Carlos is much harder to submit, as where Matt Brown's much easier to submit. So that's the other thing, is if this fight does hit the ground, I'm leaning towards Condon even heavier than on the feet. But either way, I'm just leaning towards Condon to either win by decision or submission. Next is Max Holloway versus Calvin Kattar, and to me, this is the best fight on the card and the closest. I think that Kattar is the type of guy that, is strong in every single round and arguably gets stronger, kind of like Max, as the fight goes on. The biggest thing for me is I think that Max's volume's a little bit better. Kattar's punching power is a little bit better. The other thing is I still think Kattar can't check kicks for shit. And I think if Max kind of fights the way he did in his last fight, which I think everyone thinks he won, he was mixing up kicks a lot more in that fight than he had in his last few. He's been boxing heavy. As we're in the beginning of his career, he was more kickboxer. I think if he goes at this fight kickboxer style, I think he wins. I think Kattar still sucks at checking leg kicks. I felt like that when he fought Jeremy. I thought, even though he knocked out Jeremy in the second round, Jeremy was winning like 90% of that fight before that. And one of the things Jeremy was doing was just throwing leg kicks. And he already has that loss to the Brazilian guy where that guy just kept kicking his legs. It's a problem that he hasn't fixed, in my opinion. And I think Max is good enough to kind of just go to that well whenever he needs to. As long as he does it strategically, I think he'll get the TKO from leg kicks. I think that, Kattar's biggest problem has always been that, and I think it's going to continue to be that. Because I think, like I said, the overall striking is going to be close, but I think the one area where Max is going to be able to get a big, push on him is the leg kicks. And because of that, I'm leaning towards Holloway to win either a decision, especially in the later rounds where I think the damage will build up, because I think he probably will fight like that. Like, his coaches have got to see the same thing that I see, which is his leg kicking is still shit. So I'm going to pick Max Holloway to either win by decision or like a 4th round TKO from leg kicks. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Please subscribe.